It's December 1921, and a legendary concert is about to take place in Carnegie Hall. 15 of the most illustrious pianists of the early 20th century have gathered to commemorate and raise money for one of their dear friends, a composer whose fortunes had turned quite bleak over the past decade. The program consisted of raucous pianism and a grand finale which featured 14 pianos playing all at the same time. I know that hundreds of pianos playing at the same time is kind of a dime a dozen these days, but back then that was quite a feat. Ignaz Friedman, Josef Lhevinne, Wilhelm Backhaus, Leo Ornstein, and Percy Grainger were among the pianists present. The group managed to raise $10,000, which is about $180K in today's cash, and yet it was all in vain. The money didn't make it to their friend until the year of his death. The composer in question was Moritz Moszkowski. He began his life as one of the most prodigious and illustrious virtuosi of the 19th century, but by the 1920s, he was living in abject poverty, a fall from riches to rags, which may be one of the most bizarre stories in classical music history. If you're only familiar with Moszkowski from his lovely little character piece Étincelle, or from seeing his name as the editor on editions of Liszt, you're not alone. His unfortunate trajectory has had repercussions on his reputation which still haven't settled to this day. Anyone reading a biography of Moszkowski would be pretty shocked with how things turned out. Born into a wealthy family in Poland in 1854, he was an immediate prodigy. By age 17, he already had a teaching position, and by age 19, he had given his debut in Berlin, leading to a quickly growing reputation as a pianist who could handle really all of the classic repertoire. He was also quite a respected composer already, writing and performing his own works, which had both the bravado to fit into grand concert halls, but also the intimacy for the popular salon settings. So the scores of his pieces were quite a big source of income for him. Not to mention that he was actually a favorite of Franz Liszt, who once set up a special performance where the two of them played Moszkowski's first piano concerto together. This piece is now lost, but it's quite fun to imagine the two virtuosi of different generations coming together. Apparently he was also an amazing violin player, and he had a mustache game that most of us could only dream of. But by the 1880s, Moszkowski's fortunes began to take a turn for the worse. He developed a nervous disorder which made it pretty impossible for him to continue his busy schedule of performing as a pianist. And yet Moszkowski would make a splash with one of the only big piano pieces of his we still have to this day, the Piano Concerto in E major, Opus 59. He performed the piece in London in 1898, one of the few times he appeared in public as a pianist after developing his nervous condition. Audiences in England really loved this piece, and it's pretty easy to hear why when we listen to even just a few measures of it. It's a piece which certainly has a passionate fan base nowadays. I mean, the reason that I'm even talking about it now is because you all voted for it, so thank you for that. But already at its debut in London, it seemed like critics felt that the piece was underrated. One review in particular asked incredulously why pianists neglect this work the way they do when concerti like Schumann, Grieg, and Tchaikovsky are played endlessly. Even back then, those pieces were overplayed. The E major concerto sits at a tricky point in music history when tastes were changing and traditions were being questioned. It's definitely in the same lineage as pieces like Schumann or Grieg or Tchaikovsky, but by the early 1900s, audiences were ready for something different. For example, the concerto was dedicated to Josef Hofmann, who was one of Moszkowski's students. It's interesting because Hofmann actually never played the piece, but I think the dedication makes sense. Hofmann is a pianist associated with the Romantic tradition, and Moszkowski's concerto really sits beautifully in that. But there's another concerto that was also dedicated to Josef Hofmann that he also never performed, Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto. And though it was written only about a decade after Moszkowski's E major concerto, the two pieces could not be more different. Of course, they're both huge, virtuosic, difficult to perform, but that's just a surface level similarity. Rachmaninoff's concerto has a kind of emotional weight that it wears on its sleeve that Moszkowski's concerto simply does not. this lightness and joy was a part of who Moszkowski was. He was a completely different person than Rachmaninoff. He was known for being witty and funny and just a great person to hang out with, despite all of the hardships that he experienced. It's quite understandable that he had so many friends who were willing to kind of fight for him at the end of his life. And while this hopefulness and lightness is what makes the concerto so wonderful, it might also be what has held it back from wider recognition. For example, if we think about the big romantic concertos from around the same time, like Grieg, Tchaikovsky, Schumann, Rachmaninoff, who else we got? Chopin. All of these concerti are written in minor keys. The only composer that I can think of who wrote kind of like a big romantic concerto in a major key is none other than Franz Liszt, so it kind of makes sense that he connected with Moszkowski so well. So perhaps the E major concerto was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that sort of seems to be a theme of Moszkowski's life as an artist overall. In the early 1900s, interest in his music began to wane. He wasn't selling as many scores as he had been before. Audiences were much more interested in the musical renegades like Busoni, Debussy, Scriabin, composers who, to put it lightly, Moszkowski didn't care for. And instead of simply continuing to follow his own path, Moszkowski was extremely discouraged by the success of these more adventurous composers. It doesn't help that Moszkowski invested all his wealth into securities which completely crashed during the First World War, leading to his ultimate financial destitution. And it seems like even in the 100 years since his death, time hasn't really managed to repair the damage that changing musical tastes did to his reputation. Music history kind of Mike Wazowski'd Moszkowski. Paderewski allegedly said, "After Chopin, Moszkowski best understands how to write for the piano." But there is a huge gap between the number of performances of the two Chopin concerti, which we hear dozens of times every season, and the E major of Moszkowski. And it might be a bit controversial to say this, but I would love to maybe have about half or 3/4 less performances of Chopin concerto if it meant that we could have maybe 2 or 3 performances of the Moszkowski. It's not a competition, but when we hear one piece so often, and it's not even the best piece in my opinion by that composer, I think there's room for something new.
And that is the tea.
Of course, Chopin and Moszkowski are totally different composers, and it's not even fair to really compare them. The musicologist John Cody Haddo, whose work I read a lot in preparation for making this video, he summarizes the difference between these two composers quite well. Certainly, both Chopin and Moszkowski are distinguished by this ability to exploit the keyboard, but Chopin's gift for it was only peripheral to his central message, whereas in Moszkowski, it amounts to being the central message much of the time. A comparison might be made between a great painter and a talented, even inspired interior designer. One looks for different things from each, and while a great painting may move and inspire us, it cannot be denied that a beautiful interior is one of civilization's notable compensations. The only sensible way to describe Moszkowski's style is to call it a very eclectic synthesis, which resulted in an unclassifiable and thereby individual body of work. It's quite difficult for music history to process composers who had this kind of eclectic attitude. Composers who it's not so easy to pin down exactly what kind of movement, what kind of aesthetic they belong to. But nowadays, in 2026, with all of history behind us, I think that we can handle complexity a little bit better. And as such, maybe it's the perfect time to reevaluate Moszkowski's work. Looking at the concerto, we see the trademarks of Moszkowski's pianism. Hand crossings, which some likened to those of Scarlatti, alternating hands playing chords, which was similar to Liszt, of course, And the most characteristic of all, alternating hands in passage work, something which is really well displayed also in his famous work Ettinsel. Though Moszkowski was certainly not the only composer to use these figurations, his way of going about it is quite individual. It's sparkling, it's exciting, and, dare I say, even a bit optimistic. Despite all his life hardships, Moszkowski's works, and especially the E major concerto, often feel quite joyous, quite hopeful. And in the serious space of the concert hall, where many of us go hoping to have our hearts absolutely torn asunder by Bach 3 or Tchaikovsky, that kind of optimism can be a bit difficult to understand. Actually, I've recently been preparing for some big concerts and competitions, and I've been feeling like my practicing needs a little bit of a refresh. Thankfully, Tonebase has just released a really helpful PDF which you can download for free, How the World's Top Pianists Actually Practice. It has been super helpful for me. It has really easy to understand and simple to follow practice exercises which you can try right away. You can get access to this PDF for free by clicking the link in the description below. Moszkowski's fate was a combination of things that were out of his control and parts of his personality that were perhaps unchangeable. Shifting musical tastes, his own stubbornness, health issues, a global catastrophe which he probably couldn't have foreseen. But perhaps there's hope for this concerto yet. I've noticed that there's quite a lot of people on the internet who have really been passionate about bringing this concerto back to life. Like I said, I've gotten comments asking me to make a video about this for quite some time now, and I'm really glad that I finally did, because sitting down to listen to this piece was a really wonderful experience. It's absolutely beautiful. I would love to learn it myself. I'm a little afraid to, because it sounds really quite challenging, but it seems like it would be worth playing, and I think it would be really successful to listen to live. And there are pianists nowadays who have done the work to learn this quite challenging piece and bring it to wider audiences. People like Piers Lane and Matti Raikallio, they have learned and recorded this piece in a way that really does justice to all that it has to offer. And for me as a pianist, I find this really inspiring, because it means that by bringing this piece to the foreground, you're not doing something that everybody else does. You're not following the easy path. You're going a little bit against the tide of history to play something which you believe in, something that you think that we should listen to, something that has been ignored by audiences for far too long. A few days after his death in 1925, an obituary was published about Moszkowski in Musical America, which I think really summarizes his legacy well. In his music, Moszkowski had the gift of appealing to the cultivated musical mind, and at the same time satisfying that longing for melody which, without question, is a universal human characteristic. His compositions teem with melody, naked and unashamed, and when he hit upon a pretty tune, he let it remain as such, and did not juggle it about and torment it into various shapes. I think this summarizes Moszkowski so well, why his music has inspired both such indifference and also so many passionate defenders. It's not the kind of music that hits you in the face with its importance or scale or asserts its compositional complexity. And believe me, there is a time and a place for that. I mean, just a few months ago, I was talking about the Schoenberg Concerto, which I also love, and it's like exactly doing just that. But Moszkowski does something in his music which is actually a lot harder than it sounds. He allows the beauty of the figurations, the simple pleasure of his melodies, the subtle pathos and emotional richness to speak for itself. Sometimes it's okay to want a happy ending, and Moszkowski's E major concerto certainly gives us that. It's now up to us the people who love this piece, to demand to hear it more, and perhaps, over the coming decades, we can make up for a century of missed opportunities. Thanks so much for joining us today. It was so much fun to learn about this concerto. Like I said, thank you all for recommending it to me. Let me know which piece you think I should talk about next. There were a few other concerti in that same poll where the Moszkowski won, which I think would also be very good candidates, but I'm very open to topic suggestions, so let me know what you want me to focus on. And let me know if you learned something new, or if you have heard the Moszkowski concerto, which performance of it actually is your favorite. That's another thing that I was kind of struggling with myself. I listened to several different recordings and they all have pros and cons, I think. So let me know as well which one you think is the best. And if you're on your own piano journey, then I highly suggest downloading the free PDF from Tonebase Premium, the platform that makes videos like this possible. It's how the world's top pianists actually practice, a 36-page Bible of excellent practice skills, which, like I said, I have been using myself recently as I've been practicing quite a lot. You can get access to that by clicking the link in the description below. I'm Robert Fleitz from Tonebase, and I'll see you next time. He began his life as one of the most illustrious virtuosi of the It's kind of like music history Mike Wazowski Moszkowski.